The 50mm 1.8 from Canon costs only 120 euros, was the very first lens I ever bought and is still part of my absolute standard setup. So I really have this thing with me on almost every shoot. But why is that? Why is the so-called Nifty 50 both incredibly good and yet incredibly cheap? 50mm lenses are actually some of the easiest to produce. This is mainly because 50mm is exactly the so-called normal focal length. That means at 50mm we have almost no perspective distortion. In other words, it's almost like a window pane. The light that comes in on one side goes out on the other side exactly the same. So the normal focal length is right in the middle between the wide-angle range, where the light has to be refracted in one direction, and the telephoto range, where the light has to be refracted in the other direction. Well, and yes, that is somewhat simplified, but it is relatively cheap to put a bit of window glass in a plastic housing, which is kinda self-explanatory, right? Fun fact, this rule also applies, not always, but in most cases, the other way around. That is, the further the focal length of a lens is from the 50mm, the more expensive the lens is in most cases. Another reason this lens is so cheap is that it is a prime lens. That means you can't zoom with this lens, but you're always nailed down to exactly 50mm. Well, and it is also quite logically explained why this is cheap to produce. Because if you don't have to install any moving parts in your lens, but instead build a fixed static thing, then it is of course easier to build. Okay, fine. The thing is cheap, but why is it still so incredibly good? Well, we've already established that 50mm is the normal focal length. And a lens with normal focal length is not only easy to build, but the images also look very natural because it comes very close to what our human eyes sees. A wide-angle photo will always be distorted in one direction, and a telephoto will always be distorted in the other direction. And that can of course be used specifically as a stylistic choice, but normal focal length simply looks, well, very normal. And because this thing is so easy to build, Canon has given it another special feature that you usually have to pay a lot of money for. Because with an aperture of 1.8, the lens is relatively fast. That means if you want to create that smooth out of focus bokeh in the background, you'll need exactly a lens like this. Being fast also means that because we can open the aperture so wide, even in low light, relatively much light makes it to the sensor and the images become relatively bright, even in poor lighting conditions. And this is absolutely priceless, for example, for a wedding in a dim church. And still, the images taken with this lens remain absolutely crisp sharp. Otherwise, with fast lenses, you sometimes have the problem that at full aperture, the images become a bit washed out. Looking at this lovely friend of mine, for example. But nothing against my 85 1.2, I love that thing. And even though this thing is so incredibly cheap and such a beast, it's delightfully small and handy and the perfect lens to just throw into the camera bag. Who knows where you might need it. So if you want to take the next step in your photography, this thing is really affordable for almost everyone.